Good evening and welcome to the BFI Network by BAFTA Crew live stream session on finding and funding your debut. Sorry we started a tiny bit late, we had some computer problems. I'm your chair, Rowan Woods. I currently wear various freelance hats, but was most recently a development executive at BBC Films. Now before we start, I just need to do a bit of boring housekeeping. We're not expecting Eva or Ivana to say anything particularly controversial, I hope. But I should just say that all opinions expressed by the panel or myself are ours and do not reflect the views of BAFTA. I also want to say hello to the BFI Network Film Hub North gang who are watching on the live stream now in the Hull Truck Theatre. Hello. And hi to anyone watching the recorded version of this in the days and weeks to come. So with me this evening to discuss finding and funding your debut feature are Eva Yates, New Talent Commissioning Exec at BBC Films, and Ivana McKinnon, Independent Producer and Executive Producer. We're going to leave time for questions at the end, but just to say as we go along, if you've got questions, just raise your hand and we'll make it quite kind of informal and conversational. So, just to give us some context and kick us off, do you both want to start by telling us a little bit about yourselves and your relationship to new talent and debut features, perhaps either things you've worked on or things that you're currently working on? Ivana, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so I'm an independent producer. I've got a production company called Stray Bear Films. I most recently produced a film called Beast that came out this year, and before that exec produced a film called War Book, which was written by Jack Thorne, directed by Tom Harper. Prior to being an independent producer, I used to work for a company called Cloud 8 Films, which before that was Celador. And while I was there, I worked for a producer who made a whole raft of films, and I produced my first film there, which was a debut feature, which was Tom Harper's debut feature and Jack Thorne's debut feature, which was called The Scouting Book for Boys. So I've done quite a lot of debuts and enjoy them, and I currently have a slate of projects which is quite varied, some by more established filmmakers, but quite a lot of them are by emerging talent, and that's partly because there's really, really great emerging talent in this country right now.
There really is.
Really, really great, sort of exciting, ambitious people wanting to make their first films. Yeah, that's really the main reason.
Fab. Eva?
So I'm a commissioning executive at BBC Films. I specifically look after the new talent end of our slate. So we have a lot of debuts and short films as well that we are developing at the moment, which we hope to production finance in the future. And we also are one of the partners on both iFeatures and Microwave. So we have slates of films coming through from those two streams as well.
Brilliant. So as a filmmaker or producer, before you even want to think about funding or getting something made, you need to find the right material, and whether that's something that's something that you really want to make, something that can get made, and something that's also going to be successful enough by whatever your metric of success is to sort of kickstart your career going forwards. And we'll come back to that idea of success and how you measure it further on. But just to start off really generally, in your experience, what are the hallmarks of a great first feature?
I mean, I think.
And there's obviously no one size fits all.
No, but I think really, I think if it's a great first feature, there's hallmarks of a great film, and that's a different thing. But a great first feature should be a statement of intent. You know, it should be like, this is who I am. This is what I have to say. This is how I work. Something that makes you go, oh wow, who is this person? You know, and that doesn't necessarily just need to be the director. It can also be the writer. No one knows what the producer does, but you know. But who is this person, and what do they have to say, and why is that exciting? Is I think kind of the only really important thing.
Would you concur with? Is there anything else you'd want to add to that?
I agree. I guess I mean, people are sending things to us rather than us going out and searching. Well, that's certainly the model that exists. So we get pitched an awful lot, and I guess a lot of it boils down to originality. A lot of it boils down to the things that we think, where the idea and the intention matches what we think the skills of that filmmaker are. So, you know, we work with people from so many different avenues, but you kind of want to believe that that person is the right person to make that film on top of the idea being something that's exciting.
And I suppose sort of combining what you're both saying, it sort of comes down to kind of voice and authorship. Often the thing that's seen to, I mean, the boundaries between TV and film are becoming very blurred now, but often it's thought to be about voice and authorship. And how important is that something to be thinking about? You know, why is this the story that you should be telling? What have you got to say that perhaps no one else has got to say?
I think it's really important, but that doesn't necessarily need to be I'm telling a story that no one's told. It can be I work with actors in a way that no one else works with actors. You know, there's other ways to sort of show that distinctive thing that you do, which is special, that no one else is doing.
Also, I think it's hard because I think we talk about voice so much, but actually as soon as you start trying to define your own, it becomes quite problematic. So I guess it's something we're looking for, but it's not something we necessarily expect people to express about themselves walking in the room. It's sort of, it's something that evolves over time. I think a lot of people feel as though they have to have got to that point of knowing exactly how to define their own work before they're even pitching their first feature film, and I just don't think that's always possible. I think we sort of, certainly from the commissioning side, you're looking at people who you hope you'll go on a long journey with rather than just choosing that one project. So sort of partly about allowing yourself to evolve over time and become something different as a filmmaker too. So distinctive, yes, but the question of voice is a really hard one, I think.
And often, as you say, it's something that only really emerges in retrospect, and you can sort of engage, impose an overarching vision over something. And what sort of relationship, if any, should a first feature have to your previous body of work, to the shorts that you've already made? Should you be looking to work, in a similar sort of tonal registry or in a similar sort of genre space?
I don't think there's any point making shorts that aren't going to lead you to the path of your feature. If you're only making the shorts in order to get to a feature, then I think you need to make every short count. But that's not to say doing a pilot or a scene from your feature or knowing necessarily exactly what that feature is always the only way to do it. I think it's about making each of those steps count if ultimately you're making shorts in order to get to that end game. It's sort of having, without losing the creativity of it, it's about having a sort of strategy around your own progress, I suppose.
It can be really problematic to kind of have someone who's done loads of comedy shorts and then they want to give you a drama feature and you're like, you just have to show that you can do it.
Yeah.
But I do think also I would say that, that shorts, a lot of people do make shorts strategically to get to a feature, but there is also a way of making shorts which is just really testing your hand and trying it out and doing it cheaply and getting a lot of experience. And there's nothing wrong with trying lots of different shorts in lots of different genres. It's just really that kind of, most people have a big short they make before they make a feature, which costs quite a lot of money, and that one should be definitely on the road to your feature. And also, there's lots of people making short film content nowadays where it's not necessarily something they're doing just to get to a feature. They're doing it because they're kind of great ways to tell different kinds of stories, and there's an opportunity out there, certainly with kind of the VOD platforms and stuff, to tell short stories. And actually, the short story format and the short film format is a lot harder to make brilliant than a feature film. So in its own right, there's a kind of value to that, I think.
And what's the relationship? In what sense should a filmmaker be thinking about where they want to be in 5 years' time? For example, when they make their first short, should you be thinking about, okay, well, ideally I'd like my second feature to be such and such, and I've got this really, really great, like, mega budget sci-fi project that I want to make, but I know I can't make that now. How strategic and sort of canny should filmmakers be about plotting their path? Whilst at the same time understanding that it's almost impossible to plot a path because you never quite know what's going to get funded at any stage.
I think I often ask that question of what's the film you're making in 5 years rather than the first one, because I think for me it's about the conversation of understanding the skills and the instincts and the taste and the ability of that filmmaker as we're going through a process of working out whether or not there's somebody that we might be able to support. I would be very surprised if any of those people I asked that question 5 years ago were actually doing what they said they were going to do.
Yeah, I would ask that question. So I think the conceptual idea of, I'd like to make films like this, that's a really valid question. But, you guys have both worked in this world for a while. I can't think of anyone who's told me, like there's lots of people who say, I've got this idea for a first feature, and then I've got this idea, this is definitely going to be the film I'm making in 5 years' time. I've never seen it actually happen, because life changes and they get interested in other things. And actually, I'd be interested to know if you ever have seen someone who had a game plan that
I don't think I have actually.
No. But also good filmmakers look at their first film and go, oh, now I see what I'm really good at. You know,
Yes.
it's partly about learning from what you do, and again, it's about your evolution. So I think it's really important to have ambition, and I think we really want to support people who want to make multiple films, not just have a go at making one. But it's just so difficult to predict the realities of that. And you know, if you think about the debuts of recent years, including things like Beast, which Ivana made, actually those filmmakers are now in a situation where they're negotiating the ideas they've had for a long time versus the things that are being sent to them versus the new ideas that might be emerging because they've figured out what actually they felt really excited about in the process of making the first. So I guess it's like your horizons open out in ways you aren't able to anticipate until you've been through that process.
And it's
and
good.
the world changes, the industry changes, and the kind of stories you want to tell change.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to be open and alive to that change and to those conversations and the opportunities that will come up. And to what extent is it important? I mean, obviously you want to. It's all about the kind of creative idea, but it's also about an audience. You know, a film is barely a film until it's in front of an audience, and in a distribution landscape that's feels like it's changing almost by the minute. To what extent does a filmmaker need to think about the audience and, you know, even a potential distribution strategy and where they want their film to play?
I think the conversation around audience is hard because I think a lot of people think that means you have to meet a lot of people, whereas I think sometimes knowing your audience, but it being quite a niche audience, is just as valuable. I also think lots of people, I mean, a lot of filmmakers, and it always rings an alarm bell, a lot of filmmakers come in and say, I don't care, I'm not making this for anyone else, I'm making it for myself. And in that situation, it's not so much that they have a sort of lack of interest in audience as the fact that they're not really going to interrogate the process of how their work is going to make someone else feel, that is the problematic part of it for me. If they don't feel as though the way in which their work is going to meet someone else is a valuable part of how they build the story, then I think you've genuinely got a problem, because you're not really doing it in the context of the way in which it's actually going to be received.
So it's really important for filmmakers to be thinking about that. It's not just the producer's job to think about where that film is going to.
But I think in a probably more expansive way than just who's your audience. I think it's sort of about going, what's this going to say to people who are going to watch it? How are you going to make people feel in doing this? What's the perspectives that you've chosen, and how is that going to do things you want this film to do and say things you want this film to say?
I once did some mentoring on something with Tristan Gallagher from the Bureau. Did I ever tell you this thing he did? He did this brilliant thing. He sat down, it was a group of filmmakers, and he sat them all down and he went through a list of all the films that had been released, all the UK films that had been released at the cinema that year. And, you know, we've had a couple of really good years for UK film, like films that actually people are going to see, debuts that people are going to see. It's been brilliant. But, you know, a few years ago, that was less the case. And he went through this list of British films and he said, put your hand up if you've seen this film. And for each film, maybe one person of 12 put their hand up. And at the end, he listed 4 big American movies. And every single person there put their hand up. And he said, okay, why are you making films that you're not going to see? You know, why are you making films because you think they're cool or they're edgy or they're kind of dark, you know, but you're not actually getting off your couch, sofa, whatever, and paying money to go and see these films? You know, either go and see these British films because you love them and you love this kind of storytelling, or make a film you'll go and see, you know? And that really I found very interesting as a provocation.
Yeah.
Because I think there is a real temptation for people to, you know, be slightly pretentious about the film that they want to make, and then you go, would you pay money to see that at the cinema? Are you really responding to it as a watcher? Are you responding to it as something that you want to kind of create but you wouldn't be interested in watching? You're right. I mean, it's been such an exciting time. Do either of you have any, and you may not, but have any sort of thoughts off the top of your head about why that might be? Is it just that public funding is in a very exciting place? Is it just that we happen to have had filmmakers, you know, like Francis Lee and Michael Pearce and Deborah Hayward, who've come through, who've all had really exciting things to say and are, you know, clearly very talented? Or is there?
clearly something in the water.
I think once it starts happening, people get more ambitious and it gets exciting, and it's sort of
It's emboldening, isn't it?
Yeah, people watch each other and go, oh, I can tell a story that's kind of I can push myself a little bit further. Someone said to me that whenever the Tories are in power, art gets better. So that might also be part of it.
It's also, I think there is a lot more, I think there's more public funding, I think there's more money for short form, which is not necessarily coming out of public funding or broadcasters or whatever. Like, there's a lot more space for people to try things, experiment, hone their craft, work out what they're good at. You know, I think because there's that much more content being created, it just means that people can evolve more before they hit that point of figuring out what they want to make as a full-length feature.
Yeah, I think you guys as up-and-coming filmmakers and producers and screenwriters are all in a very, very exciting time. And then let's talk about the kind of the timing. Obviously, as a filmmaker, you want to just go and make films as soon as you possibly can. Is there, again, I'm sure there's no one size fits all, but is there a certain point at which you go, okay, you are ready to make your feature? How do you know when you're ready?
I think you have to. I don't know.
Is it about someone else telling you that you're ready? So I'm sure as a filmmaker,
it's really
you're
problematic
always
if
ready.
you do that because I think any scenario, if you're making films and you're waiting for other people to give you permission to do it, I think that's just a really problematic notion, because you're constantly, you know, there's a lot of no's that will come your way. Some of them will come from me, some of them come from other places, some of them will come, you know, there are lots of places that are curating a relatively small slate, so probably I would say 99% of the people I meet I say no to, and that's not, I wish that wasn't the case, but it's the reality of the fact that we have quite a limited budget to spend each year, and so we have to really work out how we want to spread that and how that goes between established filmmakers, new filmmakers, the types of stories they're telling, the type of reach they're going to have, all of those different things. But waiting for somebody else to say you're ready is hard, and also the development process of a film is so long that if you wait until someone says you're ready to make a feature before you start developing your first feature, you're definitely really, really, really pissed off that you're not making a feature yet by the time you actually have a script that's good to go. So I think you have to preempt. I think it's more about identifying the people who you think are talented and then allowing that moment to happen in a much more natural way, rather than kind of going, okay, now someone will press a green button for you. So I think it's much more about filmmakers individually taking responsibility for that and sort of negotiating the yeses and the nos and the maybe what do I still need to do in order to get to a point where I've proved I've got the ability to do this.
I'm thinking about what they're not good at themselves, you know, and actually working on that, because you know, there might be one person who just comes out of thin air and is ready to make a feature, and another person needs to make 20 shorts to make a feature, you know. And there's people, and I think one of the problems we have in the film industry is that everything costs so much money, you know, that it's really hard to fail enough to like learn from your failure, and you don't really learn except from failing. So, you know, there's people who might need to get experience with actors. Like, can you go and work with like RADA and Lambda and do those kind of short films that they do with up-and-coming actors? Can you get some actors to come and sit in a room with you and just workshop with you for 3 days and shoot some stuff? You know, it's like, it's kind of taking that responsibility into your own hands and going, what am I able to do to get myself to a point where I can convincingly go in a room with someone else and say to them, I've done the hard work, I'm ready to do a film, you know? And that's a different question for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that self-awareness is really key, because, you know, making a feature before you are actually ready can have an incredible, I mean, it's been quite an incredibly damaging effect on your long-term career, and it's hard enough to get a second feature made. You really have to, you know, whilst needing to be ambitious and bold, you also have to be the right kind of cautious. So let's talk about scale. Is there a particular budget level that filmmakers and producers should realistically be looking at? I mean, again, there's no sort of one size fits all, and someone may be, and Eva, I will ask you about a particular example in a minute. You know, some people straight out the block may be able to make something that's incredibly ambitious and incredibly expensive. What are your thoughts on the sort of scale, sort of budget wise, that people should be looking at?
I think lots of people sort of choose the path of take the opportunity that's in front of them rather than necessarily figuring that out, and then they scale their project in order to meet that. So,
and is that the right way to do it?
Not always, but it's one. I mean, it's the reality of the fact that there are structured schemes in this country which are an incredibly good opportunity for filmmakers to build their film, build relationships with financiers, and also become part of a bigger film community and meet peers and start to build those relationships, which are also just so valuable throughout your career. So iFeatures is now 500 to 750, so all of those films will have to work at that scale. I find most people come in and pitch me. Every debut comes in and is pitched at 1.2 million because everybody knows BFI 500, BBC 500, tax credit to 200 or 250, and then they know that that's a kind of really neat, easy way to get yourself structured. So they all say that number, and then it starts to move up and down once you actually interrogate the script and what it's really about and what the filmmaker actually needs in order to be properly resourced, and the reality of people's different processes and people's strengths and weaknesses means that number obviously shifts enormously. But equally, some people end up making, I think there's lots of examples of people who've gone on and made incredibly high budget first features, and quite often those people have been, quite often happens when people have been very, very successful in other art forms and then have moved across to film. So suddenly they've sort of already got a door that's quite open for them. But I think also sometimes that cost is partly to do with sort of facilitating the right people around that filmmaker in order to keep them lifted in order to make a film of that scale. So,
yes.
An incredibly expensive DP puts your budget right up, but also means that you have it's sort of how... that's partly about weighing up risk, I think, in the end. It's like if somebody inexperienced is going to make something of huge scale, then suddenly a lot of other things get more expensive too, because you're sort of building around them in order to accommodate those elements that they're just going to have to find a way to make work with the sort of pressure that's on them of that finance. Yeah.
So, for example, in that vein, let's talk about Remy Weeks's debut film, His House, which is sort of an astonishing budget for someone who is so green. How did that end up feeling like an investment that was worth taking and not something that felt incredibly risky? So, tell us a little bit about what the budget is and about the project. And
I don't know if that budget.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm not sure if
big.
it's out there, but it's big. It's a high budget debut film. That was almost entirely. I mean, we are a very small corner in the build of that film. So a studio, that script was a very good script. It sort of ended up landing in the US with somebody who then ended up distributing it very, very wide. As a result of that, a lot of studios put bids in to secure it, and they were putting, I guess, numbers on it which were about what they thought it may work as. They were sort of putting numbers on it which were about what they thought then might be made from it, rather than what was actually required in order to make it. So it's almost exactly the reverse of how we would work, in that I was sort of going, hang on, has anybody actually costed it up? Let's just cost it so up and then make it for the right price. Whereas it was coming from such a commercial perspective that it became about something different. So then actually that film had an incredibly experienced DP. It had a very, very, very good team of people. It's a very high VFX film. It has a fantastic cast, but not people who are particularly known as film stars yet. I think they will be off the back of it. And a director who had worked very, very steadily and brilliantly in an environment which was not really about narrative filmmaking, but really had an incredibly high production value and technical understanding of what he was doing, combined with the fact that he had completely imagined this world and sort of just gone off and written a script by himself brilliantly. So there's kind of a lot of unusual factors in it, but ultimately I would not have budgeted the film at that, but the sort of relationship with the studio and their expectations of it and what that then meant they needed in order to feel as though it would succeed meant that there were sort of different costs on it than if we'd done the independent version of us and BFI and whatever other equity we needed in order to get it. So sometimes those happen. You see lots of filmmakers make a incredibly cheap first film, and then their second film, but suddenly they're in the US and they're making $50 million films. And again, that's the reality is they're no different to the person who then goes on and makes a 5, but they got the team around them that means that there was absolute security. And also the freedom of creative process is completely changed because actually you must deliver the film which is going to make that money allowed. So there are points at which there will be an intervention in order to make it be able to hit that necessity, I suppose.
So off the back of that, let's talk a little bit about collaborators. I mean, I can imagine very often a filmmaker will want to work with the collaborators that, you know, the DP and the editor with whom they've made, you know, and the producer with whom they've made their shorts and already have a sort of creative shorthand with. Is that necessarily the right way to do it? I mean, as a funder, you may well decide that, you know, given the budget, actually you sort of need them to work with a more expensive or more experienced DP in order to secure your investment. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's about weighing up the sort of skills and experience of that director and what you think. I don't know, it's interesting, there's a film that we're prepping at the moment, which is a filmmaker who works in a very particular way, has a very, very close collaboration with his DP. She's never shot a feature film. Their shorts together have absolutely made sense. Their creative process absolutely makes sense. The way in which they interact around preparing their work is really unusual and sort of meets the needs of the way that he wants to build his films. So there was never a scenario in which I would have wanted to break that very, very meaningful collaboration in order to put him in, you know, perceived safer hands. I think it would actually destabilize rather than stabilize that project. And also, I think if we're all sitting here talking about new talent, you have to, you know, lots of people forget about producers as new talent. I think that's one of the things we talk about a lot at BBC is that writers and directors are absolutely new talent, but producers have to be treated as new talent too and be given opportunities, and HODs have to too, because I think there are certain areas in terms of crew which are really at quite a major shortage at the moment in the UK industry, and if we don't allow people who maybe haven't cut a first feature yet, but have shown to be very, very capable and shown to have a really good relationship with the filmmaker, then we also have to put some trust in the producers. Yeah. You know, and if they've really seen that relationship at work and seen how those two people will collaborate and they really believe that the film could get made, then we also have to back those creative decisions sometimes. And that's not to say we won't intervene if we feel there's something that is gonna really damage the possibility of the film succeeding, but ultimately I think we have to do as much as we can to try and facilitate those ongoing relationships so the next generation of crew moves through as well as the next generation of writers.
Yes, you know, which can also mean, you know, pairing perhaps an emerging producer with a more experienced producer, which isn't necessarily something a funder asked for, but you know, you and Lauren working together on War Book.
And we didn't have any funds. I mean, we had Archer's Mark give us £100,000. We were going to make that film for 40 grand. I was having a baby, so I was like, Lauren, do you want to make this film for 40 grand? She said, yes.
But having a more experienced collaborator in you was enabled Lauren to then sort of cut her teeth in that sort of way.
Really, I think when it works well, it works very well. The other thing I would just say about the HOD thing is the one I feel like people often do have fights about is editor. And actually, it's a funny one because the editor is the one person who can get fired without the whole film falling apart. So actually, I feel like it's the easiest one to kind of say yes to and give someone a chance and see how it goes. And often you have this line in your budget, which is a kind of secret potential extra editor line if it all goes wrong.
And at what stage in the process, you know, as a producer or as a filmmaker, should you start thinking about funding? I mean, obviously, there's no point in writing or envisioning a perfect script if the budget is so outrageous that it will never get made. So those two things have to go hand in hand a little bit. But at what stage does one have to start thinking about that? Perhaps that's a question for you, Ivana.
I mean, I think I do feel like 10 or 15 years ago, when I was sort of much younger in the film industry, directors in particular were more able to be these kind of hermetically sealed people who were like, I've just written this film and I just want to make it. And now I feel the newer generation of directors have much more producerial skills. Like they think about the industry more, they think about audiences more, they think about budgets more. It's probably just the internet, but they're more connected into things. And I think, you know, that can sometimes result in a bit of backwards engineering, which takes away creativity, but often I think it's a really good thing. So I feel like most of the people I would meet would be thinking about stuff like that from early on. But I have had experiences. I'm working with a writer-director on a debut at the moment, and we've got a project with him as a writer as well. And he had a script that he got set up for development funding, which was a brilliant script, which he still wants to make as his second or third film, but it's sort of a £3 to £5 million film. And actually he got a bit stuck because that was the project that he had been awarded development funding for. Quite obviously wasn't going to be his first film. And then it got to a point where then he kind of presented his first film for development funding. They said, well, we funded you for this thing that's impossible for you to make until you make another film. So that was quite a tricky situation to kind of navigate. And I do think it's worth being aware of the fact that if the film that you're developing just is not going to get made as your first film, then you should probably hold that back as the thing that the industry know you for. Yes. Because it then becomes very difficult to kind of bring this other film into the world. But yeah, I feel like most of the people I come across are thinking about that. Maybe I'm just very fortunate.
And how important is it to secure funding from one of the main three, BBC, Film 4, BFI? You know, there are lots of schemes and things, but if you can't, and maybe this is a question for you, what are your other options?
I mean, there's money everywhere. There's like bits of money everywhere that you can kind of draw on, and you know, there's films that kind of crop up all the time that have not been funded by any of those three major bodies. And you know, some of which are absolutely brilliant, and it's always really exciting when that happens because actually no one really knows about them before they appear, and then everyone goes, "Oh my God, what's this?" It does make it easier if you are funded by one of those three major sort of parties, partly because you know they are really good organisations full of great people, and you know everything's going to kind of work out the way you want it to in terms of the money will be there, it'll be contracted properly, everyone knows what they're doing. And also, there's just a higher profile to the whole thing. So, you know, things like iFeatures, it's not just the money and the kind of the process that is valuable. It's the fact that you're an iFeatures film, and therefore you have a huge profile, and you know, festivals are kind of interested, and there's just an extra benefit that comes along with that. But I think there's a real story to be told around films that have not been, you know, I mean, it's a long time ago, but something like Castelnvarga, Peter Strickland's first film, that he basically made with like the money that his auntie gave him when she died, and instead of buying a house he made Castelnvarga, and it came out, and the story around that was like, this film couldn't have been made if it had gone through any of these kind of normal processes, because actually the decisions that he was making were made in a kind of really independent way. And I think that's probably less true nowadays. I think there's a more independent spirit anyway, but I do think that, you know, there are always funding sources, and you make those work for you, and then you can make the narrative around that work for you really well if you make a good film. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, no, it absolutely does. And I think as an emerging, you know, whether you're a filmmaker, you're a writer or a producer, you want to be sort of building those relationships with the funding bodies at quite an early stage. You know, you may not get funding, but you may not get funding for your first feature, but you may get funding for your second feature. And at what stage should people be thinking about building those relationships? And is that about people coming to you, Eva, for example, or is that about you going out and sort of tapping people on the shoulder?
I think it ends up being both, just because I guess we have quite a big appetite for finding good new people, and we also know that not everybody will necessarily know the avenue. So if there are people who aren't coming to us, we will go and try and find them. But I guess, I mean, people come at every stage. I'm always glad if somebody's made a great short. I'm really happy. I'm really glad if they send it to us. One of us in our team will always watch. And we get invited to short film screenings all the time. We get invited to other work all the time. In our team, we go to table reads. We see a lot of theatre. We do all of that kind of thing. But I guess a lot of thinking about the stuff that's going to shoot this year with us, a lot of those filmmakers I probably met 5 years ago, and actually, you know, maybe funded a short with them, or maybe, you know, they kept sending me their work, or we kept having conversations. I might have helped them to find a producer or helped them to find an agent or whatever, but it's sort of the balance between the sheer volume of people who are out there who want to make films, the reality that a very, very tiny percentage will be good enough to do it, and an even tinier percentage will then be able to be the recipient of public funding in order to do it, means that we sort of have to balance off what we seek out versus what we get sent. And our engagement in the end needs to come at a point where there's a producer who's actually going to make the film.
Yes.
So I'm really glad when I meet great writers or directors, but the conversation proper only really begins when they've actually found a producer who's going to facilitate that process and support them in making the right choice around what the project is that they want to see through. And then we have a recipient for the money. Then we have a way in which the actual film can get made. Up until that point, it's so speculative. So that's really, I mean, so many of the meetings I have with talent who don't yet know what their next project is end with, okay, you need to go meet some producers. And often their agent will then facilitate that, or, you know, they will go out themselves and seek out people who are, you know, getting vision awards from the BFI, through things like BFI Network, through, you know, all of those different structures that exist, all of those schemes that are out there to support emerging filmmakers. They will somehow then find, you know, build that collaborative relationship. And I think given that filmmaking is such a collaborative art form, if you can't get to that point where you found that person who wants to go on the journey with you, then you're probably missing one of the skills that you need more than anything in the process of filmmaking. So,
I mean, that's probably one of the questions I got asked the most when working in development was, how do I find producers?
Yeah.
But as you say, that they're out there.
And all the
about building.
producers are going, how do I find projects? It doesn't really make sense.
This feels like a good moment to throw in a question from Facebook. So Mezid Chowdhury says, as an independent filmmaker who doesn't have representation, what would be the route to approaching networks or studios with a pitch? I
mean, there's not much we can do until one of those two people are involved in that film process, because what they're not actually doing is yet engaging in the making of the film. They're engaging in having an idea. So.
And you're not producers,
we're not producers.
You're funders.
So actually they need to be using these kind of environments where there are a lot of people who all want to meet other people as ways to build that and then go forward. I mean, every so often a project will come along which is absolutely brilliant, where we'll say we'll try and facilitate some kind of very loose matchmaking where we suggest people, but actually it's just not, we just can't do that most of the time. There's just too many people who are coming asking for that. And I think there are lots of things like BFI Network which are aimed at people who are slightly earlier in their career than maybe we're able to support. So it's about figuring out how you can use all of those pre-existing networks that sort of come one rung earlier than we might be able to come.
And once a producer has come on board, and you've got someone who is driving it forward, and you've also got a sort of a script and an idea, you know, as financiers or in your capacity as an exec producer, what inspires enough confidence to go, you know, actually this is something we're going to come on board and help support or to fund? Is it purely the idea? Is it also about the filmmaker's track record? Is it about their vision? Is it about the way they pitch it? Is it about the market's appetite? Is it a sort of heady brew of all of those?
All of them. All of them. I mean, yes, definitely always about their past work. Partly about how they then talk about that past work. I find it really interesting if somebody comes in and has made something quite flawed and can tell you why they think it doesn't work. I'm always really glad if people kind of engage in what they've done and where the successes and failures are, because then you can see that they're going to get better and better. The idea, yes, I think because in terms of new talent, certainly on the director side, it becomes so much about who you think that person is and how engaged they are in actually having something to say, rather than, you know, you meet quite a lot of people who want to make films rather than want to say something by making films. And I think sort of slightly separating those two and working out who actually has something to say by making films is really, really important. And beyond that, it you know, there's also lots of things of we're already doing some of that, and how much of that can we do in a year? And, you know, there's also the sort of more practical concerns around the fact that we care about who's making films and making sure that there's a range of different voices and ideas and perspectives in everything we're doing. So there's a bit of that too. But it probably, for me, in the end, quite a lot of it boils down to being in a room with somebody and going, I think you're really, really interesting and really special. And I think that idea can definitely be a film. And that's sort of, I mean, that's not a very helpful answer,
So
but it's sort of the
intangible,
truth.
isn't it?
I think we're like, filmmaking basically is about telling stories, right? So like when you're in a room with someone, you want them to tell you a story about themselves, which is what you're saying when you're like, how do you talk about your past work? It's like, what's the story of you? It's not just I've done some work, I'm brilliant. It's like, how did you get to be here? Where do you want to get to? Who are you? Tell us the story of the project you want to make. And then you want to be part of the story of that person and their work, you know. And if they can't tell you that story compellingly, then they're probably not an exciting enough storyteller for you to want to make a film with them, you know? Like you should come out of a meeting feeling really excited by the story you've been told, and that story is part them, it's part the project, it's part, you know, the kind of like group of people they've built around themselves. I think there's real value for certainly all filmmakers, but certainly emerging filmmakers in building a group of people around you, like finding your kind of crew, and then sort of representing that to the rest of the industry. And it's like, you know, we're just doing this, we're just a train that's moving. We're going to make this film, and it's really exciting. And here's some cool people I'm working with. And do you want to be a part of that boring old funder? You know, it's like that's sort of the best thing where you're like, oh God, I'm just like a boring old.
Let's jump
we
on.
might miss
Yeah,
out.
that sounds amazing. You know, you sound like you're really doing something cool. That's kind of the story you want to be hearing. You know, you don't want people to be going, oh, could I have £2.50 to buy a lens? That's not a good story. You know.
And I think that's key, because I think producers and filmmakers get very get nervous or sort of place too much emphasis on the idea of the pitch. You know, that you have to have either, you know, an elevator pitch, or you've got to go in with a kind of sizzle reel and a mood board and all of those, which can be nice sort of additions and can be helpful. But actually it's about that conversation, isn't it? And just creating a connection rather than feeling like you have to have an all singing, all dancing kind of elevator
Formal
pitch
pitching, it does never happen.
It
Just never happens. Every meeting is just a conversation where you say, what do you want to make? How do you want to make it? What have you done? What do you need? And then we'll work out whether or not we can be part of that or not. But I agree, I'm really, really much more excited when somebody comes in and says, this is what I'm going to make. Are you interested? Rather than sort of, it's really hard when people come in, and like I said this earlier, but when people come in and are sort of waiting for you to tell them they're good enough in order to do it, it's like you have to, we did a really interesting session on iFeatures a few weeks ago where John Glazer came in and talked about his process, and the way in which he talked about meeting his own expectations before presenting his work to anybody else to get any kind of feedback was such a brilliant thing, I think, for all the filmmakers to hear, because it's kind of like, oh, if I'm my own critic and my level is high enough, then I'm not constantly going and asking other people to tell me if my work is okay. Actually, what I'm doing is saying, this is good enough, are you in? And I think that's also the point you were making, but it's so much better when people are sort of holding themselves to account around their work. So actually it's not about quality, it's about something slightly different. And that's the hard thing with the being yeses and nos in lots of these situations. Actually, some of the nos are like, not this one. Some of them are, probably your filmmaking isn't good enough and therefore we may never be able to fund you. And some of it is the reality of what else is in front of you as somebody who has to make decisions which are about a much bigger picture, and trying to be part of something that's shifting culture at the same time as creating good work and everything else. So there's that too.
That feels like a really good moment to open it out to you guys. I don't know if there's any. I know you were all very, very quiet and attentive as we went along. But do any of you have any questions? Come on, don't be shy. Anyone? Yes, just here.
I was wondering how part of some of what you said might change or not change, if in regards to the debut being a book adaptation, and whether that changes how you think about the project, or whether it's, I know there's things like Lady Macbeth quite recently, or whether you'd think about that in a very different way, rather than something that was an original spec script.
So just for audiences in Hull, in case you couldn't hear, it's just the question is about does any of the advice and things that we've discussed already this evening change when you're looking at book adaptations?
Yes, because you've got a ticking clock. So suddenly you've got a cost attached rather than just exploring an idea. Suddenly you've also got to work out how long you've got to write it, what that cost is going to be, what limitations that might bring, whether or not the writer of that piece of work is in some way going to expect to have a relationship with the film. So I think it sort of brings an extra layer that means you can be less kind of free and speculative about how you engage with that work, but also that's not to say don't do it. I mean, I think if you find a brilliant piece of material that you believe in and you can get the option on, then
you know, and then there can be out of copyright work, you know, sort of older books, where I think you then sort of have to ask the question as well about, is there an audience for that book and how are you talking to that audience, you know, and which is not, it's not really a debut question, it's more a question of like an adaptation just as a slightly different thing, because it's like the difference between if someone comes in and pitches you a completely original story out of their brain, then you're basically just kind of analysing the interpretation you have of what they've said and whether or not what they've said is actually what's inside their head. Whereas if there's a book you're talking about, there's a solid thing that you can all read and you can talk about and you can go, we like this, we don't like this. You know, it's a much more, you feel you're much more advanced in the conversation of what the film could be, even though you're still miles away from it, because you have to write a script from a book and that's really hard. But, you know, that's why adaptations happen a lot, actually, I think, because there's a kind of solid thing that everyone can go, we're all comfortable with the idea that this is what we're aiming to do. But that's not really, it's not so much a question about debuts, it's more a question I guess in terms of debuts, it just, like, there's some writers who are brilliant at adapting books and terrible at doing original screenplays, you know, and then there's the opposite. And I think it's probably about an understanding of who you are as a writer or director and how you respond to a piece of material. And that's a different sort of set of equations if it's a book or original thing. And if you're coming to it and you haven't done something like that before, then you have to believe that someone can really see that through and make it distinctive and brilliant enough and get the best out of it and not get lost in the material.
And this is not directed at you, but I think there are lots of people who lean towards books because actually they feel they have to write their work, but they don't necessarily have a story to tell. And if that's the situation, work with a writer. Please work with a writer. I think so many people feel that they have to write their first film because somehow that will be more respected, or there'll be more of an auteur, or somehow that's the way in which they can be more in control. But actually, if you're not a writer, it's really okay not to be a writer. It's really okay to work with many brilliant writers who are out there.
So many writers who are out there
who could do it with you.
With a good director.
And I think that's a thing that we talk about a lot at the moment, actually. How do we help newer filmmakers who feel they have to write rather than actually wanting to write get to a place where they're happy with the collaboration that they could be in, rather than, because it can also means you can make more work, you can move faster, you can sort of have a more prolific career if you make that choice early, if it's the right choice for you.
Great. Yes, one right at the back.
I wanted to ask, what's the sort of early warning signs that something is a car crash, in the sense that I mean that you know, sometimes you get the kind of the sense that a producer is attached to something, and I'm only talking about shorts at this point, but you get the sense that a producer is kind of attached in a way that is just to have someone attached. You know what I mean? When people are kind of just at random pairing up on stuff and then applying for stuff, rather than, you know, I direct, this person produces, here's something we've done before, rather than we've paired up, we'd like to make that. Like, what are the kind of things, I know you said if someone's not reflective about their work, you kind of start to think, but what are the other key things that you'd kind of go, there's some, just the things, you're all looking at me like I'm saying.
No, I'm thinking about what the answer is.
It's a really hard question to answer.
And just let me, again, I'm not quite sure exactly how the technical thing is working, but just in case the audiences can't hear the question, it's about what are the common pitfalls or any sort of red flags that may come up that make you go, oh God, this project doesn't feel like it's going in the right direction.
I mean, people don't, like, a filmmaker and a producer directly contradicting themselves in front of us is definitely a big worry, because in the end they're coming in to try and make us feel as though there's a secure relationship and a great idea. So that's a very obvious one. I mean, the thing that I guess the thing that happens a lot and is always really sort of hard to get back out of is when a lot of new writers get really, really trapped in plot and don't understand that actually that is, as soon as you're in a conversation where all you're talking about is plot, you're definitely not working on a screenplay that is succeeding. So I think there's a lot that often ends up being a conversation where you go, do you know what, you need to stop a draft and you need to go back to figuring out actually where this story is coming from and who the characters are, because you're sort of worrying about all the wrong things. You know, if it gets to the point where it feels that unnatural, then something has definitely gone wrong.
Yeah, I think it's a really good thing to do yourself if you've got a writer, say you've got a writer, director, and a producer on a project. It's a really good exercise at a certain point to say, could everyone just go off and write 2 pages about what they think this film is on their own, and then come back and share that with each other, just to make sure that we're all making the same film? Because everyone wants to hear what they want to hear, you know, and you can quite easily get yourself in a situation where one person thinks they're making one film and another person thinks they're making a completely different film, and you don't want to end up either in front of a funder or an actor or an HOD or anyone else with that being exposed. You just don't want to end up making a film with that exposed, obviously. It would be terrible. But I think that kind of thing is really easy to slide into, actually.
And also quite easy to avoid, as you say,
Yep.
with the right with the right approach. I think there was another question just here.
You mentioned that there's money everywhere.
I knew someone was going to pull you up on that.
The money tree.
I heard that. Tell us
Please, could you draw a map?
I mean,
So the question is about money. The
myth
of money being everywhere.
the thing about money. So when I say money is everywhere for funding films, I don't mean here's a map and here's where the money is. It's more like, have you seen The Princess Bride?
Sure.
Okay, you know where they're going through the forest and the fire things come up and then they disappear? It's more like that. Like a pot of money appears, someone grabs it and then it's gone. And then a pot of money appears over here. Essentially, a rich person says, I want to invest in a film. That sounds like a really good idea. Maybe I'll make my money back. Well, no, I mean, you know, but they also go out and try and find projects, you know. So that is also about this sort of trying to. I think the thing, you have to talk to everyone all the time about everything. Like you have to, if you're looking for the money tree or you're looking for collaborators or anything, you have to have endless energy, you know. And that person you met at a party like 3 years ago who seemed like a complete crazy person might be the person who calls you up and goes, I've just met someone who wants to invest this money in a film, you know. It's like, that's kind of how you find it. Not it's not a map. It's like the person you met 3 years ago at a party who you thought was mad, who calls you up and says this person wants to invest some money. So I know that's a really bad answer, but if there was a better answer, then we'd all just be lining up.
The reality
wouldn't
is
we?
there's lots of people trying their hand and seeing whether A, it can be a lucrative thing, which usually it's not, and B, whether they get enough, they find it interesting enough to want to keep putting their money in. So it's sort of, I mean, I'm amazed every year I go to a festival and there's something I see where I've never heard of the investors on it, and it's often a British debut, and you go, God, who are these? Suddenly these people are now in the mix as well. Like we have this kind of endless list that we're constantly like scratching people off and adding people on of like, who are the possible people when we get to a point where all these debuts we're developing, like who can we take them to if the kind of more obvious partners don't come through, like how can we help producers to bring that money in? That list is endlessly evolving, and it's pretty long. I mean, it's sort of surprising because a lot of sales agents now are happy to find ways to bring you pots of equity if that means that they A, get the film from you, and B, get a little bit more of a relationship with the talent that's involved. I mean, in terms of short form, it feels like there are so many avenues now. You know, looking at the stuff that's on, I think BFI this year have had more shorts than they've ever had. You know, iFeatures, we had 800 people applying and almost all of those people have made shorts. So you kind of look at the volume of stuff that's being created, it's like there is definitely more cash than there's ever been. But yeah, it's about being inventive and looking in unexpected places.
There's sort of weird
and
places,
parties,
like often
apparently.
kind of, you know, just talk to everyone. You know, there's sometimes kind of commercials companies go, we want to invest in a film to kind of, you know, for a different reason, to boost our kind of our value or our kind of credentials. Or, you know, I once had a meeting with IKEA. who wanted to fund a film for 500 grand, but it had to be made in the next 3 months. It's not going to happen, you know, but there's stuff like that that kind of appears and then disappears quite quickly.
Also, as a subject for film, my graduation film, I wanted to shoot in Ghana. There was no way I could do it, but Divine Chocolates. I was like, yes, it's in Africa where they grow cocoa and they pay for all the flights.
Yeah.
Wow.
Perfect example.
There you go.
You know.
So it's usually the script will tell you where to look, the subject matter, who's interested, who's their cup of tea, and then you chase those people.
Yeah, and there are. I think that's a really interesting place to look, like the people who are not investing their money because they actually think they're going to get their money back, you know, but people who are investing their money because they get another benefit from it, you know, and certainly if you're looking to kind of raise a small budget, you can put it together from sort of odd places if you are creative about that.
Any final questions before we wrap up? Yes.
I was interested in what you said about how you enter the funding sort of arena, and that's how you're going to be perceived, and that's sort of who you are. What if you're entering with sort of two hats, in the sense that I'm a writer and I'm much more experienced as a writer, so I can write feature, but and I'm also entering as a director, but I'm much less experienced as a writer-director. Can you wear two hats in the sort of funding arena, or do you become sort of known for what you do?
I think that's fine. I'm not a funder. For me, that's completely fine. It's like you're a writer. You know, even you could be like, I'm a writer. I write sci-fi, but I want to direct comedy. I'd be like, fine. I'm actually okay with that. I think that's what's more problematic is when people are producers and writers, or producers and directors. I think because there's a sort of almost like a conflict of interest between being the person who is supposed to be kind of getting the money and in charge and you know. Managing the thing, and the person who's over here trying to kind of create the art, you know, and lots of actors, for example, kind of decide I'm gonna write my first film, or I'm gonna direct my first film, but I'm also gonna produce it, and
be
it's
in
really
it.
problematic.
Red flag. Okay, one final question at the back, and then we have to wrap up.
Yeah, you mentioned Deborah Hayward and Francis Lee. And I think they made their debuts sort of in their 40s, late 40s. Is the industry accepting of people who haven't made it like in their early 30s?
Yes.
So the question is about whether you can still make your first feature, you know, if you're not in your 20s.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good story is a good story. A good piece of work is a good piece of work. And I think I think the label new talent can be problematic for people, because I think most people who get to the point of making their first feature feel very not new. I think a lot of people feel like they absolutely should not be called new anymore by the time they're doing that. But I don't think it has anything to do with age in the end. It's to do with, you know, there are an awful lot, like you say, there's a lot of people who've had great success who haven't necessarily thought in the very beginning of their career that filmmaking was the thing that they wanted to do, or they've gone on kind of unusual path, or it's taken them a long time to get their thing off the ground. But I think I think it can't be a question in the end.
I think also, like, I do this myself, and I catch myself when I'm doing it, but people sort of there's a lot of a verbal tick where you interchange young and new, you know, and I mean, nothing doesn't mean anything, but I think particularly that is just a verbal tick. You know, you kind of go young talent, and actually you mean new talent, and it's like someone goes, well, what about if you're 50? And you go, oh no, absolutely, 100%. You know, it's not. It's a sort of tick we have, but I don't think it actually means anything when you meet someone who you find interesting. You don't think, you know, you can't make a film because you're 50, 60. You think, wow, you've got something really interesting to say, and you're quite mature. That's a good thing, you know.
Yeah, and you've lived enough to have a story, and you know, in the case of Francis, he'd worked as an actor for a long time, so actually you can see the quality of the performances in his film as a result of having had that experience beforehand. I don't think it can matter at all.
So a good project is a good project is a good place to end on. Eva, thank you so much. Ivana, thank you so much. Thanks so much for you guys for listening and your questions. Cheers.